Well, the US is certainly not in a better position, but I would certainly say that the world is in a better position.
Donald Trump has signed a bad deal with Iran that almost looks like Americans have surrendered to Iran.
As far as that main issue is concerned, we are back at square one.
And it's a memorandum of understanding. If it doesn't get done in 60 days, it's all right. We go back to bombing.
People who have advocated for wars in the past actually arguing that the only way out for Donald Trump from this war would essentially be accepting the terms and conditions of the Iranians. Is that what do you see that has happened?
That Iran now has, in fact, a certain kind of locus standi as far as navigation through the Strait of Hormuz is concerned. As far as the US is concerned, one can say that it has actually got a bad deal because the alternative would be much worse.
Why do you think Donald Trump walked into this war, a war that all his predecessors chose to remain away from?
I was able to do something that none of my predecessors were courageous enough to do. What he thought was a very easy win in Venezuela, he thought this would also be an easy walk.
And unlike Barack Hussein Obama, who sent Iran pallets of cash and any relief they receive under this deal, they'll have to get based on merit. And it won't be from us. We don't have to give them anything.
Trump withdraws or threatens to withdraw that support or dilute that support. This would be an existential threat to Israel. So I don't think that Israel has much of a room for maneuver to try and undercut this deal.
Another significant part of this MOU is that $300 billion towards reconstruction.
The fact is that Iran has demonstrated that whenever it wants, it can threaten shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has now emerged as perhaps one of the most powerful countries in the region.
Prime Minister Modi's visit to Israel. Why did the Indian government choose to do what it did?
I do not think Netanyahu had to tell the Prime Minister that something like this might happen. Anybody who was watching the situation would know that something like this is a risk. Watching this from outside, it appears to me that perhaps this was a miscalculation.
We've also seen Prime Minister Manmohan Singh standing on American soil, telling George Bush in front of him that the invasion of Iraq was wrong.
So I think the lesson one should have drawn is that, look, there is a need to draw a line.
Hello and a very warm welcome to yet another edition of the Foreign Policy Dialogue, the podcast where we have a deep dive look into issues of global importance. This is the 18th of June as I record this conversation. Viewers, of course, get to see this episode on Sunday. Now, between Thursday to Sunday, a lot of things, of course, could change, but we look at the larger picture, connecting all the dots that do exist. And on this episode, I have a very special guest with me, retired Ambassador Shyam Saran, former Foreign Secretary of India, somebody who was also the former, in fact, special envoy of the Prime Minister on climate issues, and one of the key architects of the India-US civilian nuclear deal that transformed the landscape of that very important bilateral relationship. So on today's episode, we are going to talk about the two big stories that concern India. One, of course, that Islamabad Accord between Tehran and Washington, D.C. that has been penned by President Donald Trump in Versailles in France in the presence of Emmanuel Macron, while Pezeshkian, the president of Iran, signed it virtually, and Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif signing it too, as Pakistan serves as a guarantor on the accord. And the second big story, that meeting between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Donald Trump along the sidelines of the G7 summit in France at a time when the bilateral relationship has seen much tumult. Ambassador Saran, of course, is also the author of many important books that must be read by all of you who are interested in foreign policy. Thank you so much, Ambassador Saran, for joining me in this conversation today.
Thank you for inviting me.
If I could begin by, asking your thoughts today. Of course, you've already penned recent articles where you've argued that how Donald Trump has been losing the Iran war. When you look at this accord that has been signed, is America in a better position? than 20th of February when this war started with that Israeli aggression? Is the world in a better position today?
Well, the US is certainly not in a better position, but I would certainly say that the world is in a better position because the end of the hostilities and what we hope is an enduring peace agreement means that the enormous strain which was put on the global economy, on the energy economy, on global shipping, all these strains will begin to ease somewhat. It will take some time, but it would begin to ease. And India has a very big stake in this because, as you know, our energy security has been impacted. There has been impact on travel, on aviation because of the shortage of aviation fuel. So I would say, from the point of view of the global economy, and certainly from the point of view of India's own economic interests, this deal is good news. Not so much for the United States of America.
Let's take this thought, forward, sir. Of course, we are already looking at a barrage of reactions coming in from the United States, including voices within the Republicans who say that Donald Trump has signed a bad deal with Iran that almost looks like Americans have surrendered to Iran. But in these past few weeks, when the war stretched out beyond the initial calculation of it, perhaps lasting just for a 7 or a 10-day period, we have also seen many of the neocons, people who have advocated for wars in the past, actually arguing that the only way out for Donald Trump from this war would essentially be accepting the terms and conditions of the Iranians. Is that what do you see that has happened?
I think the for Trump, if you watched his press conference in France after the deal was signed, I think you get a fairly clear picture of what was the main driver of his agreeing to these terms and conditions. One, he said, was the what was happening with the global economy, what was happening with the U.S. Economy, the fact that he tried to spin it by saying, what was the most important thing? The most important thing was that Iran will not get a nuclear weapon. But what has Iran done except to reaffirm what has been its consistent position all through, that it is a member of the non-proliferation treaty, it will not acquire a nuclear weapon. So as far as that main issue is concerned, we are back at square one. And most important gain for Iran, even if it has to make some concessions on the nuclear issue, is the fact that it has acquired a huge leverage in terms of the Strait of Hormuz. And in a sense, these 14 points recognize that Iran now has, in fact, a certain kind of locus standi as far as navigation through the Strait of Hormuz is concerned. So I think as far as the US is concerned, one can say that it has actually got a bad deal because the alternative would be much worse. That is, the deal is to be welcomed, because if the alternative is to continue with the war, the consequences will be much worse. So it is really choosing between the lesser of two evils. I think that's the best way to describe it. So for the US, the fact that they can hopefully put this behind them and get on with other more important things is perhaps in one sense a gain. It has been a very difficult decision for Mr. Trump, but I think he has done the right thing in terms of walking out of a very, very bad situation for himself and for the United States of America.
Of course, there are too many ifs and buts that still remains there. And now, with the wisdom of hindsight, I mean, a war that began on 20th of February, and then America began Operation Epic Fury. I know we are all external watchers and observers at this point in time, but given your, long experience of understanding diplomacy as it happens, why do you think Donald Trump walked into this war, a war that all his predecessors chose to remain away from. Despite all the military aggressions and interventions that we saw over the decades, be it Iraq, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, the American presidents chose to stay away from a direct war in Iran. Why do you think Trump agreed to this war with Netanyahu?
Maybe that is precisely the reason that he can do something that none of his predecessors before were able to do. And that is what he said. You know, I was able to do something that none of my predecessors were courageous enough to do. So I think he thought this is going to be an easy win. And maybe Benjamin Netanyahu had a role to play in this, in convincing him that they had excellent intelligence which they would share with the United States of America, that you could wipe out the entire leadership of Iran, that it would literally collapse with under the pressure of this carpet bombing, and this will be notched up as yet another big win for the United States of America. And I think after having achieved what he thought was a very easy win in Venezuela, he thought this would also be an easy walk, and has been proved wrong. So I think he was led into this because he thought this would be an easy win. By the way, other countries also thought this would be an easy win. And
I think including India too, sir. I have inside
yes,
stories.
I think there was a miscalculation on the part of India that otherwise I cannot see why Prime Minister Modi would have gone to visit Israel when there were all signs that there was probably going to be a war very soon.
I'm going to come back to this very crucial element in the discussion, but I just want to go back again to what you started your conversation with, saying that you hope that this accord paves the way for an enduring peace. And all of it definitely is hinged on how does Israel react? What does Netanyahu do next? I mean, this deal could have been announced a few days ago itself, but on that very day, Israel did choose to go and strike on Beirut in Dahia, which is something that publicly has been rebuked also, in fact, by Trump. So, do you really think Israel and Netanyahu sitting back and watching this accord play out for the next 60 days?
Well, to the extent that Israel security and its economic security as well is so heavily dependent upon American support, if Trump withdraws or threatens to withdraw that support or dilute that support, this would be an existential threat to Israel. Maybe a worse threat than the existential threat that Iran poses to Israel. So I think while Trump, in fact, was swayed by Benjamin Netanyahu and his perceptions about what the situation was, I think Trump, if you look at his statements in the recent past, including in that press conference that I mentioned, he is very clear that he will not allow Israel to in any way sabotage this peace deal, because the consequences of that, of a resumption of war for the United States of America itself, are really dire. So I don't think that Israel has much of a room for maneuver to try and undercut this deal. That is my sense. I may be wrong, but I suspect that Israel does not have that kind of room for maneuver vis-a-vis the United States of America.
So, could you please repeat the sentence your frame went away? That I don't think Israel has that kind of room.
What I was saying was that I do not believe that Israel is in a position to really sabotage this deal or undermine this deal if the United States of America and Trump have already made it clear to Israel that any such action would be very detrimental to the relationship between Israel and the United States. Because Israel is very heavily dependent upon US economic support and US military support. Now, if there is even a hint that that might be in some way impacted, Israel does not have much room for maneuver.
So, I mean, I'm staying on with this thought because while we do understand there has been a significant shift in the attitude both within the American Congress and the American public when it comes to whether Americans should continue giving a free pass to Israel, to Netanyahu, with what they've been doing in Gaza, to Lebanon, but that American Jewish lobby continues to be extremely strong. And for Netanyahu, if it's not Netanyahu, then you have the likes of a Ben Gavir to a Smotrich, none of them wanting to really sort of back down and saying that they will continue to do what they need to do, whether it is in Lebanon or whether it is against Hamas, regardless of what the Americans ask them or try to restrain them.
So, if you look at what happened during the war, it was about a 100-day war or whatever period it was. What is not very clear to people outside is how much damage Iran was able to inflict on Israel by its missile strikes. And by the way, it did not really use its best missiles. It did not use, for example, its hypersonic missiles. So a considerable amount of damage was done to Israel, despite the fact that it had access to, not only the Iron Dome, but also the Patriot anti-missile systems. When those systems ran out, actually the United States of America denuded those installations in other Gulf countries in order to safeguard Israel. In fact, that was one of the complaints by some of the Gulf states that, you chose to defend Israel more and not us, even though you are an ally. Now, if the United States of America tomorrow says, if you do this, no more, missile defense systems for you, or in some way denying Israel that. Now, Israel's ability to withstand another assault by the Iranians on them, I think that would give them pause, because right now they are standing on the shoulders of the Americans in order to defend themselves. Will they be able to defend themselves if that American support? I don't think the Americans will completely, deny that support. But even if there is a diminution of that support, even if there is a suspicion that that might be not available to the extent that it was before, that will certainly lead to a rethink in Israel. And by the way, whatever the Israelis may be saying, and they are very, very angry and upset with what Trump has done, but essentially they have listened to what Trump wants them to do.
Just a last question on this subject before I move on to that very particular lens on India, US, and India, West Asia. Another significant part of this MOU is that $300 billion towards reconstruction of Iran, of course, looking at a sort of a regional mechanism for this payout. Americans lifting all, sanctions, also releasing frozen assets. We don't know the exact amount of frozen assets to be released, but we do believe it will be at least to the tunes of $12 billion and above, if not more. All of these, we are looking at a much stronger regional player in Iran today. How has this changed West Asia?
Oh, it is completely reordering the political and security equations in the Gulf. No doubt about it. More important than 300 billion that has been promised as reconstruction, that is, it has been somehow conditioned by, Iran has to have the right kind of investment conditions, and it should be able to attract that capital into Iran. More important than that 300 billion, which is something which is I'm quite skeptical about. What is important is that the frozen assets of Iran, nobody knows exactly how much is the total amount. Some people say it is something like $100 billion. And what has been promised immediately is about $25 billion in two tranches of 12 or $13 billion each. So that itself is a big gain for Iran. More importantly, a source of continuing income, that is the sale of oil and gas by Iran, uninterrupted by any sanctions, that is the biggest deal. It's not just one time funds becoming available to Iran. What you have is a source of continuing income being assured for the next several years. That makes Iran not only militarily a powerful state with demonstrated capability of being able to withstand the joint might of the United States and Israel, but also the possibility of now emerging as a very economically prosperous over a period of time, a prosperous, Iran as well. So there is no way that you can escape the conclusion that you have now a new powerful actor on the scene in the Gulf, with also its hand on the Gulf of Hormuz. Gulf of Hormuz, even if it is agreed that the existing rules of international waterway continue to be observed. The fact is that Iran has demonstrated that whenever it wants, it can threaten shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. As soon as that threat emerges or is announced, insurance companies will start, not insuring, shipping through the Gulf. And that is all that Iran needs. It doesn't need to even fire any missiles. Just the threat of affecting navigation gives it huge leverage. So, at the end of the day, there is no way that you can escape the conclusion that out of all that has happened in the Gulf, Iran has now emerged as perhaps one of the most powerful countries in the region. And this is being recognized by, for example, even the UAE hardline against Iran, reaching out to the Iranians, engaging with them, quietly releasing some some of the frozen assets in UAE banks. Also, Qatar releasing money to them. Others engaging in political negotiations and discussions with them. So they are recognizing, even if somebody else outside does not recognize, those who matter in that region have already recognized that there is a new powerful guy in town,
Right.
and that you have to, make your peace with him.
So, despite all the death and destruction, Iran can still send in a thank you note to Donald Trump for its emergence now as this new power sort of structure. But, sir, which brings me back to what you talked about Prime Minister Modi's visit to Israel. I mean, more than 3 months after the war, that question still remains. Why did the Indian government choose to do what it did? And was Prime Minister Modi informed by Prime Minister Netanyahu of this impending attack on Iran? What are your thoughts?
I do not think that he would have informed the Prime Minister about this. But, if you asked anybody, who was watching the situation in the Gulf region, would have told you that the possibility of a war breaking out with Iran was getting bigger and bigger day by day. So, what would you do if you were a prudent, diplomat? What you would do is that you would advise your head of state that, it's a risky time to undertake such a visit. And perhaps we should wait and see how things evolve before we take a decision on this. So, I do not think Netanyahu had to tell the prime minister that something like this might happen. Anybody who was watching the situation would know that something like this is a risk. If there is a risk, then prudence demands that you sit back and wait for things to become clearer before you undertake such a visit.
But we still chose that risk. Not only chose that risk, the Prime Minister
So
went in there, addressed the Knesset, did not mention about the Palestinians or the genocide in Gaza. So India did choose to side with Israel and also with the UAE in this war.
As right in the beginning, as we agreed, that there was perhaps an expectation that, this may be, if a war comes, it may be a short war, It may be something which would result in the defeat of the Iranians. And in a sense, we may be even on the side of the winners. What explains, for example, uh, the the very extraordinary decision not to send a condolence message when the supreme leader was killed or other Iranian leaders were killed. Obviously, you recognize that you had made a mistake when 6 days later your foreign secretary went to the Iranian embassy and signed the condolence book. So I think I don't know inside what would have happened, but watching this from outside, it appears to me that perhaps this was a miscalculation.
So I do want to ask you, I mean, and this miscalculation also seemed to continue, whether it was the killing of more than 168 young girls in that school in Minab, whether it was the killing of the Iranian sailors on Iris Dana, which was sunk and torpedoed by that US submarine in a very important strategic maritime region, the Indian Ocean region. So, I mean, did that miscalculation continue, or this argument that because we are dealing with such a transactional president in Donald Trump today, that we have limitations in terms of how far can we be moral in terms of the principles that we share and talk about on foreign policy today? Does realism really need to be completely devoid of any sense of ethics and morality?
No, it should not be. If you ask me, I would say no. But there has been not only in India but in other countries also this sense that we have to watch out for our interests. We have to be transactional if that is necessary, because this is a very hostile world around us. Everybody is looking out for himself. Therefore, we have to also look out for ourselves. Now, once you take that approach, then what we would have been a little careful about in terms of reputational damage, in terms of credibility, all those become lesser factors in decision making. I have also written about the limits of transactionalism. That it will take you only this far and no further. So I certainly belong to a school which does believe that there need to be some ethical anchors, to your foreign policy. You may not be able to every occasion observe those ethical principles and be faithful to them because of certain very very difficult situation you might find yourself in, but at least that is something which you should be aspiring for. That is something which is very important. I keep saying again and again that the most important asset that you have in diplomacy is credibility. Whether credibility in terms of your friends or credibility in terms of your adversaries. When that credibility gets eroded, then there is damage, I think, in the longer term to your interests. So
I
that's
mean,
that's something that we need to be aware of.
I completely share your sentiments because I'm equally old school, whether it is about credibility in journalism or about,
Absolutely,
transactionalism having
I think
limited.
the two professions share many of these principles. Yes.
And because I have lived through more than 2 decades of journalism covering foreign policy, where we've also seen Prime Minister Manmohan Singh standing on American soil, telling a George Bush in front of him that the invasion of Iraq was wrong, that it wasn't a rightful thing to have happened. Despite that, George Bush actually, and you were one of the key architects on the deal, pulling the weight to ensure that the civilian nuclear deal with India comes along. So, if really India were to speak its mind on issues with somebody as unpredictable as Donald Trump, keeping in mind that we have our exporters to take care of, we need that American market. We have, of course, a trade surplus with America, unlike a trade deficit with the Chinese. How much of that would really be at risk if India were to choose its words a little bit more strongly and assert itself more strongly? Can't we do that now under the current circumstances?
I acknowledge that there would be risk. So let's not minimize that. We are dealing with a country and with a leader who can do considerable damage to you. So that is acknowledged. However, I would also point to the fact that uh, if Trump is like normal bullies, you give in to bullying, you usually set yourself up for even greater bullying, even greater pressure being put on you, because you have demonstrated that actually you are very prone to giving in to pressure. Therefore, why not put even greater pressure? By the way, has this not been the experience of most of the allies, Western allies, NATO allies? Were they able to gain very much by, for example, giving in to his extortionist demands with regard to the trade agreement? So I think the lesson one should have drawn is that look, there is a need to draw a line, and I will not allow you to cross that line. You need not go, sort of into a kind of a verbal assault on the person, or condemnatory language. You can resist without necessarily, being very unpleasant about it. That is also what diplomacy is about. That you stand your ground without being unpleasant.
Is there any
So,
anecdote that comes to your mind that you would like to share with my audience at this point?
no, I mean, you talked about the Indo-US nuclear deal. There were so many occasions where we came across roadblocks, where we could not cross that line which we had drawn for ourselves. And there was a huge amount of pressure from the other side that you have to concede. We stood our ground, uh, not by shouting at the Americans or making ourselves very unpleasant, but basically making it clear that look, this far and no further. I mean, it is not possible for us to go beyond this. Once they understood that, by the way, of course, that was a different administration, that was a different president. But once they understood that, in some cases, they did back off.
So just keeping with this thought, the last two questions. I mean, we also saw that meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Donald Trump after a long gap of, and also very tumultuous times, be it that Trump claim on India-Pakistan mediation on Operation Sindhu, repeated claims, or whether the heavy tariffs, the penalty for buying discounted Russian oil, and of course, then comes this entire war itself, the impact on Hormuz. One of the key issues that was raised by Prime Minister Modi has been the killing of 3 Indian sailors in a vessel which was struck by a US missile, and announced full-fledgedly by the CENTCOM itself that, look, we've struck the vessel. Something that the Indian side wasn't actually acknowledging in its initial statement. And we saw Prime Minister Modi raise, on a larger note, the safety of seafarers, including Indian seafarers in the Hormuz and across the maritime regions. Do you think the message was conveyed, or there could have been a better way, a stronger way, a more assertive way of conveying that message?
No, I am glad that that message was conveyed. Again, as I said, you do not necessarily have to be unpleasant in conveying a message. So I'm very glad that this was not brushed aside. It was raised by the Prime Minister, and I think he did the right thing to raise it upfront. But we also saw not so much the reaction of President Trump when he said, well, it's a very dangerous profession,
Yeah,
something
he
like
was
this
asked if he
does
has
happen.
any
I
grief
mean,
or condolence to
he
express to
sort
the
of he
families.
sort of made it out, well, it's a risky profession. You are taking a risk if you are involved in that profession. But more importantly was the readout from the State Department on the reaction of Rubio to
Yes.
EM Jaishankar having raised this issue with him, basically brushing it aside and saying, you have to observe that we have certain regime in place with regard to navigation, and if you are going to violate those, there will be consequences. that is not the way you would react to a friendly country raising a concern. So this in a sense gives you a indication of how the relationship has really, the tone of the relationship, the flavor of the relationship has undergone a change. By the way, I presume you have also noted that the Pacific Command has dropped the Indo from the
I was just
Indo-Pacific.
about to ask you that how do you see
So
that,
maybe it is
keeping
a
in mind.
terminological change, but it does convey something from the other side. So we should take note that there is a certain shift that is taking place with regard to Indo-US relationship, and the sooner we recognize what the implications are for us, the better it would be. We would be better prepared.
So that shift is also happening amid that reset between US and China, Donald Trump himself referring to
Sure.
G2 again and again, and also Pakistan playing this important role in West Asia, whether it is in terms of mediation or the Trump's family's own personal investments in business interests in that region. So, that adds to our challenges as well.
It is certainly a matter of discomfort to us that Pakistan has ended up as a kind of a major geopolitical interlocutor in this case. People would say, should this not have been India's role? In terms of peacemaking here. Well, India's role would have been very difficult considering the fact that we were seen so heavily committed to one side. It would be difficult for us to play that role. In a sense, if Pakistan has played that role and has made this peace deal possible, which has gained us some, advantages, I don't see why we should make too much of this. But more importantly, I think you should separate what may be tactical sort of changes, which may be reversed when Trump is no longer there. Like, for example, some of the business deals that you talked about, where Pakistan has been able to give some personal benefit, personal profit to Trump and his family or his associates. I think more important is to look at the longer term trends in India US relations. This is why looking at some of these changes, like, for example, the Indo Pacific no longer being Indo Pacific but being Pacific now, that is not just a terminological change. That reflects a certain going back to an earlier regime in terms of maritime security. The fact that the Quad meeting took place is a good thing. I certainly consider it an encouraging sign. But I think it was more like a sort of a reassurance meeting after President Trump's G2 meeting with Xi Jinping. More importantly, again, if you listen to the press conference of Trump, he says that he raised the issue of the Iran war with President Xi Jinping and requested President Xi Jinping, please do not supply those shoulder-fired, missiles to the Iranians. And by and large, he did do that, and he added that he made the same request to Russia. Now you look at how this. How would you read this? He's a superpower making a kind of an appeal to the power that is your peer rival and making this appeal to Russia, uh, which has very close relations with Iran. Now, whether or not they actually did perform as Trump claimed, the fact that he made that appeal to them itself is very revealing, isn't it? So there is a change taking place in US China relations. There is no doubt about that. You may argue about what may be the drivers of this, but there is a change taking place. Now, I would also say that the rivalry between the US and China is structural. So it is not going to go away.
Right.
But even when there is a tactical shift in relations amongst superpowers, it has bigger impacts for those who are below them. So I keep using this simile of a pendulum, that a small change at the top results in very big changes at the bottom.
And bottom.
So the impact on other partners, more on the allies, less maybe on partners like India, but impact is there. You talk to the Japanese today, or you talk
Right.
to the Koreans, they have far greater concerns about what's happening between US and China than perhaps India is. And this is, by the way, not related just to Trump. It does reflect a certain ongoing change in the balance of forces between China and the United States. And that is not going to stop just because because Trump is no longer there. These are
Absolutely.
longer term changes that are taking place, and therefore our analysis, our focus has to be on those longer term trends and what
So,
it would
so,
mean for India.
so just to end then, keeping in mind the longer term trends that we are talking about, whether it is US, whether it is China, whether it is our reset with both of these countries, in terms of our relationship with Iran, of course, there was a huge dip in trust. We tried making up for some of the mistakes of the initial days. There were conversations that did take place between the prime minister, the Iranian president, the foreign ministers have stayed in touch. India will remain with Israel, it will remain with UAE, banking on its strategic oil reserves, long term plans. But what would be your word of advice here to end this conversation with when it comes to India's relationship with Iran moving forward?
Well, first of all, you have to recognize what I said at the beginning. I mean, the equations in this region have changed. You know, you spoke about the UAE. The fact is that UAE started being a very, very strong sort of anti-Iran, partner in the for the US in the region. Not anymore. So it has also recognized very quickly that look, Iran is here. It is geography. We can't get away from this. We cannot depend on the United States of America to be able to really defend us when the chips are down. Therefore, we have to make our peace with Iran. And any kind of security architecture which now emerges in the region has to have Iran as a key player. Now, it means you have to also recognize that these changes are taking place. You may not be able to immediately correct your posture, but I think you have to engage in diplomacy which, over a period of time, does recognize this change and adjusts our relationships accordingly. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to abandon your relationship with Israel. Israel has as much of an interest in keeping up the strategic partnership with India as India has with Israel. There is a lot of gain that we have made because of this relationship, and I think in terms of technology, in terms of defense, this relationship will continue to be important. But I think some degree of shift in terms of a more balanced posture in the region is certainly called for.
Okay, I
Because
think
without that, you will not be able to repair some of the damage which has been done to your relationship with Iran. So this is important. Now, I come back to my normal theme that the most important thing for you to do is please look at your neighborhood a little more carefully. Because I still believe that if you get your neighborhood right, if you get your periphery right, then you have far greater options in dealing with larger regional issues as well as larger global issues. You cannot jump over the neighborhood and see that you can play this role. We have made some good, policy moves with regard to, say, Sri Lanka. We are in a much better place with Sri Lanka when we were before. We have made a much better, relationship with Maldives, having started off on a really sour note. We have reasonably good relations now with the new regime in Nepal, which sees a certain advantage in having a closer relationship with India. Bhutan continues to be a very good partner. Uh, Bangladesh, I think the new government coming into office did offer an opportunity, and I think it's still an opportunity despite some of the very strange kind of lapses that have taken place on your part. Like for example, that advisor to the new prime minister coming here as delegate to the Indian Ocean, I think Rim
Yes.
Association conference. That was completely uncalled for, something very avoidable. So I think I think we would be well advised to make certain that with this new government in place, we try to establish as good a relationship as we have been able to do under difficult odds with, for example, the Maldives or with Sri Lanka. And I still believe that South Asia security architecture, which addresses India's main security concerns, is unlikely without some kind of a manageable relationship with Pakistan.
Yes.
So while there may be great I would say, a sense of worry that Pakistan has stolen a march by being a mediator here, I don't think we should be deflected by that. I think we should keep our eyes on the need for us to really be able to establish some kind of a manageable relationship with Pakistan, because just as the Gulf countries discovered that geography means that you have to deal with Iran, I think there is similar kind of a conclusion must be drawn as far as South Asia is concerned.
Of course, and of late we have also seen these media reports coming in of back channel talks beginning to happen between the two sides months after
I hope so.
Operation
I hope
Sindoor.
I would certainly welcome if there is that kind of conversation taking place. It is about time. Yeah.
Right. And I'm not going to, of course, leave you on this note in this conversation. Mine is a bilingual channel. So all the Hindi speaking audiences I know will be chasing my chat box, asking you to come back for a Hindi conversation soon. And I hope we can have a detailed conversation on India's South Asian neighborhood policy in the next few days in person with you, Ambassador Saran, when you are in Delhi next.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
As we end, is there anything interesting that you're reading these days or anything interesting that you're watching that you want to recommend to the viewers?
No, I wish I had time to read because so much is happening around us all the time that it's becoming very difficult to actually catch up on some serious reading.
Right.
But I certainly hope to be able to return to that. I'm catching up on reading that I should have done long ago. For example, I'm reading Pico Iyer at the moment, very interesting writing. So there are others, non-international relations, books that are perhaps much more interesting. So one can take a little holiday from international relations once in a while.
Absolutely. And the books keep piling up by my bedside, which there's this Japanese word to describe, which is called sondoku. But thank you so much, Ambassador Saran, for joining me here in this conversation. Always a pleasure to hear your insights.
Thank you.
And
thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks to all the viewers who tuned in. Thanks for watching. Goodbye and take care.